The demand side of the equation has so many moving parts. I mean, I almost defy anyone to sort of like try and work out exactly how much lithium is going to be used in the electric vehicle batteries, I don't know, in 2 years' time. The question there is whether the supply can be tailored to match the demand, right? That, for me, holds the key to pricing.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to the State of Play in Battery Metals on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Andy Home, Senior Metals Columnist at Thomson Reuters. We'll be discussing the ways the energy transition hasn't gone the way people thought it would in battery metals, where we stand after a brutal year in the battery metals business, and the need to manage risk that's driving new exchanges and resurging trading volumes. Hello, Andy. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hi, Dave. Happy New Year to you. Thanks for having me back.
Happy New Year to you, too. I was thinking you're just the person to help me get my head on straight, thinking about the year to come and where we are in the battery metal space and where we might be going. And I remember the last time you were here with us on the podcast, you said something that stuck with me. You said that the energy transition hasn't stopped, but it just hasn't gone the way people thought it would go. And in this podcast series where we're discussing the state of play in the battery metals markets, I thought that would be the perfect place for us to pick up the conversation. And I saw that you wrote recently in one of your articles that 2024 was, in your words, a brutal year to be in the battery metals business. So I hoped you could start off just walking us through what made it so brutal.
Let's take a little step back. Let's look at, what's been going on in these markets for the last 4 or 5 years. So 2021, 2022, it was a rip-roaring bull market. Do you remember? Cobalt, nickel, lithium, they were all going absolute gangbusters. Everyone was super excited about the EV revolution and, the exponential demand growth forecast that we were all looking at. Okay, each one of them crashed in 2022, 2023. Nickel started it, cobalt followed, lithium was last, right? We're back to sort of like where we were. But here's what happened in 2024. Nothing. They just kept on grinding steadily lower. You're getting into absolute producer pain levels, right? So we've got an industry that just 3 or 4 years ago, it was kind of like me trying to expand capacity like there was no tomorrow. We were told that the world was going to run out of this stuff. This last year, you had just seen a string of casualties, right? Plants have been closed. New mines have been mothballed. Everyone's sort of like, pushed back, any sort of investment plans. So this is a very, very difficult market for anyone trying to sort of like get into the battery metals business. It's a difficult market for those already in the battery metals business, right? And at the moment, we're just still waiting, as we were all last year, any signs of recovery.
And when you look at it, part of what's made it so brutal, that might be a little bit of a Western perspective in a way, right? Because so much of the production that's been coming on has been coming out of China. So much of the demand for electric vehicles and batteries has been coming out of China. How has China's growth and dominance really affected the whole balance of the industry?
One of the answers behind why the price crash is, of course, overproduction, right? The world has simply produced too much of these metals at a time when demand maybe wasn't quite where we expected it to be. Then let's run through them. Who dominates sort of cobalt production in the world? Chinese producers operating out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Who dominates lithium production and lithium processing? We know the answer to that. We could say in nickels, maybe slightly different because it all comes from Indonesia. But who operates the Indonesian mines and plants? It's the Chinese, right? These guys are sort of like, have basically carried on expanding even as everyone else has had a problem, right? And one of the reasons is, look, A lot of these entities, particularly in the lithium space, they're vertically integrated. They go from mine to precursor materials to battery manufacturing, all the way up to making their own EVs. These are players that are more insulated against all those such depressed prices at the very upstream part of the chain. But that is not to say they're not suffering as well. There's been reports of Chinese domestic lithium producers closing as well. They are not completely immune. They are partially protected, if you like, by vertical integration in a way that the Western supply chain hasn't evolved that far yet. It's shown signs of wanting to sort of have that sort of vertical integration. But hey, the whole point here is the West is running 10 to 15 years behind the Chinese.
I wanted to ask you about that because it's really fascinating in that China now seems to be dominating both ends of the supply chain, the production of the metals and the production of the batteries and the electric vehicles. And it's done this through important technology breakthroughs by being able to process Indonesia's relatively low-grade ore and by being able to use lithium iron phosphate, LFP batteries in about 2/3 of their new electric vehicles. Now, how did China become so innovative in this space?
Well, I'll tell you a little anecdote. We're going back about sort of 8 or 9 years now, into the last sort of like decade. And I was in Beijing for a week, first time I'd ever been there. But I was walking down a really big road, big shops on each side, hundreds of people. And I stopped in my tracks because I heard something that up until that moment in time, I had not heard before. It was the sound of a supercharged motorbike, an old school motorbike being revved down the street, right? And then I realized, hold on, everything else here is electric. Now, you go back 9 to 10 years, you tell me a Western city where you could have had that experience, when the sound of an internal combustion engine being gusted down the main street makes you stop and go, wow, they started so much earlier than us, Dave. They were sort of starting to sort of subsidize electric vehicles into their inner cities, 10, 15 years ago. They created the demand, which they then had to go and find the raw materials to generate. So the simple answer is, why are they where they are? They decided to go electric before anyone else, pretty much. And out of that, creating that demand, of course, you need then guys who are going to make you the batteries. The guys who make the batteries need the guys who are going to make the precursor materials. The guys who make the precursor materials want to find the lithium, the nickel to go to it. And so you got the entire Chinese sector, if you like, rapidly sort of like be consolidating. But it's to meet its own domestic demand first and foremost, right? We in the West have been playing catch up ever since. And we still are, by the way. One of the really interesting facts from last year, right? The new energy vehicle revolution has not stopped. Electric vehicle sales or new energy sales were up 25% globally last year, right? But here's the thing. Most of them were still sold in China. 40% growth, something like that, year-on-year sales, right? United States, Canada, 9% growth. Europe, negative, right? We sold less EVs in Europe last year than we did the year before. And that's because Germany in particular got rid of its EV subsidies. This is not just still a historical, fact. This is still the reality of the market. They are still selling more EVs than anyone else. It's the biggest marketplace and it's growing faster than any other market. Therefore, if anyone's going to be producing, right, for their domestic market, it's going to be Chinese operators.
Shocking to hear that European EV sales fell. And I wanted to ask you, with the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act and so much of a push into the battery metals and critical metals space, how is what the US is doing with the Inflation Reduction Act? Is it a different strategy or is it simply trying to catch up to China?
Consumers all over the world, and it doesn't matter whether they're Chinese, they're European, or they're North American, there's a reluctance to make the switch from internal combustion engine to electric vehicle, right? And obviously, old guys like me are particularly reluctant because this is what we've known all of our lives, right? The Chinese, when they started rolling out EVs, they put massive subsidies on it to encourage people to take it up, right? The reason European sales were down last year is Germany surprisingly took away subsidies and that market collapsed, right? The slightly disconcerting element of the sales growth in the States is it a case of everyone rushing out to buy now before the Trump administration removes the EV subsidies that Biden introduced, right? Because this is still really about an end demand story. Yeah. You only need as many minerals as you need to sort of electrify your fleet, right? So in principle, I think the Biden administration was quite right. I mean, it wanted to stimulate people like me to sort of get involved, buy an electric vehicle. It knew it would have to give me a subsidy to do that. At the same time, it knew it was short of all the critical raw materials. Therefore, a lot of money was put into it. So it was a kind of a holistic approach, if you like. I mean, they were trying to do the right thing, but there's a problem, right? Price. With the best will in the world, you cannot open, say, for example, a new North American cobalt mine when the price is at such bombed out levels. You're opening it to lose money unless you force integration. I mean, and that's, as I said, the Western supply chain, in my opinion, hasn't got there. I think what the Biden approach was, from mines to the cars, was absolutely right. But the problem is, and every country finds this, people like me, I need an incentive. You don't have to give me a subsidy if I give up my old 1987 Volkswagen, right? But that's true of the Chinese as well. You look at their sales fluctuations over the years, it's been directly correlated to subsidy schemes, whether it be in cities or certain provinces or at the national level.
And I wanted to ask you, when you turning to the other side of the supply chain, you had brought up that for a long time, U.S. producers, the trouble with opening a new mine was often permitting and getting the approvals. Now you bring up it's not only the permitting, it's the price. What does that mean for Western producers? Where do we go from here? I know you wrote in a recent article that much of the production in the U.S. has been focused more on scrap than, say, new mines. What's the role for kind of new mine production outside of China and these areas where China is very embedded?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. Either we all buy really nice, cheap, very good Chinese electric vehicles and watch our domestic automotive industries die, probably quite suddenly, or we have to do it ourselves, right, in Western markets. And you can't do it without new mines. And that's just a reality. I mean, there's lots of really interesting developments going on the battery recycling side. But, bear in mind, you need a good pool of electric vehicles to have enough batteries to recycle in the first place. So mines, if you do not want to rely on China, you're going to have to build them. Building them in the States, tricky. We know the problems with the mining laws there and how long it can take to get any mines up and running. Mines in friendly countries, such as Canada. I don't know whether you still count Canada as a friendly country under the new administration, or some of the South American countries. Yes, I mean, if you do not want to allow the Chinese to dominate the electric vehicle market, new mines and new supply chains must be built out. It is difficult, though, isn't it, if prices are bombed out at sort of multi-year low prices? Who wants to lend finance to that sort of proposition? I think the US has quite correctly seen a lot of federal investment directly and through loan organizations. And to some extent, you can say, well, that's also taking a leaf out of the Chinese book, isn't it?
And you brought up an interesting point earlier. We've been talking about what it means for producers. I want to talk a little bit about what it means for consumers. And should we expect to see increasing exports of Chinese electric vehicles into Western markets? And, is there some sort of time horizon where we should expect to begin to see that it's not just about meeting their own domestic markets needs and still importing foreign cars into China, but we'll start to see these Chinese electric vehicles showing up in the US and Europe?
All things being equal, that would be true, because the Chinese EV market is itself going through a period of intense competition. You're seeing actually a lot of smaller companies drop out of the race. It is ferocious what's going on within that sector. Obviously, exporting would be one of their preferred options. However, what do our policymakers think about that? Can I speak really? I mean, I'll speak from a European sort of perspective, if you like. Our policymakers do not want our markets to be flooded by cheap Chinese electric vehicles. Manufacturers, automotive manufacturing is kind of a core part of the European manufacturing economy, particularly in places like Germany. Yeah, it's a weird thing, right? So the best probable answer to global warming is not going to be politically possible, I would suggest. Your incoming president has a few things to say about Chinese electric vehicles and indeed all Chinese goods as well. So it will not be a free flow of goods, I don't think.
So let's get into the geopolitics because clearly China's dominance in battery metals has been raising a lot of these geopolitical issues. How do you think that President Trump will respond as he takes office? And does it make any difference that Tesla's Elon Musk is one of his most influential advisors?
As an observer to the politics of Washington from afar as well, one of the things I find curious, in a country apparently which neither side can agree on anything, there is one exception. And that is, they don't want the US to be dependent on China for critical raw materials, right? I mean, on that, I could see very little difference really between Republicans or Democrats. The language may change, but listen, Biden was pretty tough. He also sort of put tariffs on Chinese goods and Chinese metals entering the country, yeah? There has been a steady raising of barriers, I would say, to stop Chinese metals and metal products entering the States. Trump is just simply going to continue with that policy, I would imagine. The difference may be as to how aggressive he gets on finished goods. Will there be a ridiculous tariff on, for example, Chinese EVs? There could be. In broad brush terms, though, US policy towards the critical minerals question has been remarkably consistent for 2 or 3 administrations now and various changes of government. That is the one thing. Everyone wants to make American manufacturing strong again, and everyone wants to loosen the grip of the Chinese on the supply chains.
Kind of an interesting dissonance, right? Where we're still talking about these critical minerals, these critical metals, much of the language from a few years ago when everyone is expecting dramatic shortages and higher prices. And as we started this conversation, we've talked about kind of at least a near-term oversupplied market and very low prices. Is the path forward you've brought up a few times about how do you get demand back into the market? Is that where we need to be focused from a policy perspective more than on the supply side in the short term?
Demand has turned out to be the really unpredictable part of our market equation, right? In terms of moving units, absolutely. It seems subsidies work for consumers, whether they're living in Beijing, London, or San Francisco, right? But here's the thing. Not all electric vehicles are made alike. And one of the big surprises, I think, for me personally, but I think for the market as a whole, is when we talk about electric vehicles and battery metals, I think most of us are thinking of a Tesla-style vehicle, pure battery driven, right? Actually, the vehicles that sell much better than pure battery are hybrids. The world's car buyers really like hybrids, plug-in hybrids, full hybrids, extended range hybrids, and that applies to the Chinese as well, where hybrids are the rage, right? But here's the problem. Battery in a hybrid, about a third of the size and a third of the power in one of the pure battery electric vehicle, right? Which means what? Yeah, a third less of all the materials are going in to make that battery. This is a big surprise. The hybrids the Chinese are making are fantastic, by the way. I mean, from what I can tell, right? And are very popular. They get rid of that sort of range anxiety with a hybrid. I have relatives who live in rural Ireland who drive hybrids because they're not comfortable with the infrastructure for charging around them. Everyone likes them, but they changed that demand equation for battery metals quite a lot. First off, smaller batteries, right? Secondly, a lot of the batteries being used now change the chemistry, just lithium iron phosphate. No nickel, no cobalt, no manganese. So demand in terms of vehicles going up, there's 25% growth in global electric vehicles last year, right? But that's not the same as saying that's the equivalent demand for the metals, because sort of cars which are really moving fast are the hybrid models using less metals, right? This is this is the market. This is the market, if you like. This shows you that even in China, hey guys, you're all going to go battery electric. Yeah, of course you will. But I really like that hybrid. Even Chinese have to accept that this is not how they probably envisage the battery electric vehicle market evolving. We all just think they're all going to be Teslas, right? No. Hybrids, plug-in hybrids are outselling all the pure battery ones. So how that evolves, I don't know. I just regard that as customer choice. And it seems to be almost, as I said, it doesn't matter whether the customer is Chinese or Western. The hybrids have really sort of proved extraordinarily popular, which no one really expected them to do so, right? This is the way 10 years ago, everyone had written off the lithium iron phosphate batteries. No. It won't have a power modern vehicle, and the drivers won't accept it. Yeah, but now it can because they've done the technology to upgrade it so incrementally, right? So in terms of moving the EV revolution forward, subsidies obviously critical, and we shall watch very closely what happens in the United States this year. But then as part of that, subsidies cannot sort of necessarily fully sort of like take away that market power of the customer. If the customer doesn't want a pure battery and the customer wants a hybrid, customer sort of, should get a hybrid and the industry will adapt to give him or her that, right? The road to the green future has turned out to be a bit bumpier than we all expected because no one really saw the return of lithium iron phosphate technology in the way we've seen it. And no one certainly really, as far as I know, predicted that hybrids would prove much more popular than the pure batteries. Maybe they're just a stepping stone. Maybe someone like me has to go to a hybrid before I can make the final leap to a pure battery, right? But that's the way the market's evolving at the moment.
Along this bumpy road of the energy transition to electric vehicles, what the consumer wants has been unpredictable. What producers are able to bring to the market has been unpredictable, creates a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk that needs to be managed. And many of the changes that we've seen in the physical metals markets have caused disruptions in futures markets and the financial markets that are necessary to, coordinate, create price discovery, help consumers and producers manage risk. This was particularly true at the LME back in 2022. You recently wrote an article that futures trading volumes are way up and that existing and new exchanges are launching new battery metals products. I was curious, what's driving this resurgence that you're seeing in battery metals trading?
Nickel had its own very specific story, which maybe we should say was more a specific story related to the London Metal Exchange contract. The LME has worked hard to sort of restore confidence in that contract, make it more relevant to the global physical market, which maybe had been one of the original issues when that contract blew up. But evidently, judging by the return of volumes, particularly to that nickel contract, as ever, this is a market seeking to sort of hedge its price risk, right? And I've argued in the past that one of the problems with, say, for example, lithium was the lack of any such forum to manage future price risk. This then turns to the CME exchange in the States, which has now got several battery metal contracts, which seem to be faring very well. A couple of them are very new indeed, but the more established one like cobalt futures or lithium hydroxide futures have picked up genuine traction, I would say. And I'm guessing that comes from industrial players as much as anything else who are looking for a reference price, which is not a Chinese one. So price risk management, is there. We finally, I think, now have ways of sort of handling that, particularly for cobalt and lithium. It's still tentative, early days, if you like, for exchange trading, but the CME has definitely taken the lead, if you like, for Western pricing of cobalt and lithium and ability to futurize it and then sort of obviously hedge your price risk into it. But that's what drives it. Price risk. As I said, draw up a chart of sort of any of these three metals we're talking about over the last 5 years and understand that volatility and what it could mean in terms of would you like to hedge that price in any way possible? Yeah.
And it's interesting because you're also seeing, you wrote recently about other exchanges that are coming into the market or expanding their presence. What are you seeing there? What's opening up those opportunities?
We're thinking particularly about nickel, which there are still, I know, sort of reservations about the role of the London Metal Exchange in a global market that is becoming, one, both increasingly Asian, but two, is also itself evolving new product lines, nickel sulfate, for example. So, you have Abax Technologies. Abax Exchange has sort of just launched, I think earlier this month, a nickel sulfate contract to try and capture a different part of the market than that captured by the LME's refined metal contract. You've also seen Global Commodity Holdings, who already operate a coal trading platform, seeing a pickup in business on their physical nickel contract. In essence, people are just, I think, looking for the right solution to get the right product, if you like, because nickel can come in many different forms, right? One of the reasons we saw that nickel contract blowout in 2022 was the Big Short, who was the biggest producer of nickel in the world, couldn't produce it in the way that sort of was deliverable against the LME contract. So no surprise then that you're seeing others experiment around with pricing mechanisms, particularly in relatively new product lines such as nickel sulfate. I would expect to see more competition in the lithium and cobalt space as well. Why not? I mean, no market needs to be a monopoly market, right? In terms of price risk management. From the industrial user's point of view of a market, the more the merrier, as long as they're liquid, right, and don't cannibalize each other. Again, put it back into perspective. If you are not going to have Western pricing reference points, your only other ones are Chinese. And good luck with those.
And I wanted to ask you, when you look at all the changes in the physical markets and the changes that we're seeing in the financial markets that support them, the futures and options markets, do you think that the nature of metals trading is changing relative to the past? And if so, how?
Well, in my lifetime of writing about metals, which is sadly a very, very long time indeed, I mean, obviously, it has changed so much from the early days, I mean, in terms of the electronic trading. You go back, I mean, so when I started in the late 80s, the London Metal Exchange, most of the liquidity was open outcry on the trading floor, just all of it. They hadn't even got properly round to even designing an electronic trading platform at that stage. Now we live in a world of electronic futures and electronic options trading with all the quant analysis that goes with that. I mean, it's a very different place. But look, the reality of why people use markets and what they're hoping to achieve with them has never changed, right? I mean, it goes back. It doesn't matter whether I'm mining copper, lithium, whatever it is. When I go to the bank and say, could I borrow like $1 billion off you, please, to build a huge hole in the ground? They will rightly ask me, what are you going to produce and what will the price of it be? And I don't know. It's probably not going to sort of help me get that $1 billion investment. Me being able to say, hey, look, I can show you the forward curve and maybe we could do some hedging on that sort of guarantee your like funding. That's the answer, right? So the need for price hedging mechanisms doesn't change, right? Markets can change all the time. But I mean, that underlying demand, whether it be from a car manufacturer looking to lock in future purchase prices or from a producer looking to sort of hedge future selling prices, that remains a constant. Without that, there would never have been any markets.
We started the conversation talking about how things haven't always gone as expected. And I'm wondering, as we look ahead to the 2025 and beyond, I'm interested in your thoughts on, when you think about where we go from here, what are you expecting? And what do you think may not go the way that others may be expecting?
If you want to, first of all, just look at battery metals, right? The demand side of the equation has so many moving parts. I mean, I almost defy anyone to sort of try and work out exactly how much lithium is going to be used in the electric vehicle batteries, I don't know, in 1-2 years' time. The question there is whether the supply can be tailored to match the demand, right? That, for me, holds the key to pricing. And actually, we just had news out of Indonesia, but, which has become the dominant force in the nickel market. But even they are now worried about the price, and they are probably going to withhold or reduce the amount of permitted production this year. So, there's a positive sign there. But I think in the broader space, in the broader part of that question, we have, I think, a lot of uncertainty about the next US administration. We all kind of know some sort of tariffs are coming. We don't know how big the tariffs are. Will they be big enough to start a whole trade war? I really, at this moment, can't see anything but a further escalation of geopolitical tensions around the metal space. By the way, just another little thing we're going to throw in recent news development, I think came out just before Christmas. So China has been restricting exports of some of its critical metals, gallium, germanium, antimony. It's also just announced restrictions on exports of lithium processing technology, which I would suggest could be an ominous sign that the critical minerals sort of war, if you like, could be spilling or starting to spill into the battery and metal space, which, that becomes a massive potential destabilizing force if you think about it, both in terms of, physical supply flows, but pricing, even the very future of the battery metal space. Everyone who's trying to set up in that space may be using technology which was patented by Chinese, if they're going to start putting back on that. As I said, more tension. I think it's very hard to see how it's going to de-escalate in the short term, let's put it that way. But I would expect to see more export restrictions in China, coupled with more import restrictions in the US, with Europe somewhere caught somewhere in between, shot by both sides, as it were.
Thanks again to Andy Home, Senior Metals Columnist at Thomson Reuters. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The State of Play in Battery Metals. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.